Well, I was thinking this week, I noticed that on TV they keep rehashing all these old game shows. Have you noticed that? I don't watch a whole lot of network TV, but I noticed they keep having game shows on prime time and things. And I think back to one of my favorite game shows when I was a kid I used to watch called Let's Make a Deal. You remember that show with Monty Hall? I'm kind of dating myself right now. Basically what it was, people would dress up in crazy costumes. Then they would be able to guess something, and they would win a small prize, right? And then Monty Hall would get them to make a deal with them to maybe trade up for something better, or it might be something worse. And it was usually you'd present them, right? Would you like what's in this little box? Or would you like what's behind curtain number 2, And would you want to trade this? And one thing in watching that show as a kid, I started to learn that even though what was behind the curtain was usually a lot bigger, it wasn't necessarily better. As a matter of fact, most of the time, what was in the smallest package, what was in the box might be like keys to a car or tickets to a cruise or something, while behind the curtain is like a year supply of dryer sheets or something, right? And sometimes the most valuable things were the smallest things. Well, this morning, we're beginning a brand new series, going through another book of the Bible, and it's actually one of the smaller books in the Bible, but it packs a huge punch. So much like big things coming in small packages, that's what we'll be experiencing over the next several weeks as we look at the Old Testament book of Ruth. Now, this morning, we're not going to have the words up on the screen, so make sure you have your Bibles out as we go into Ruth. You can turn to the book of Ruth. It's in the Old Testament. It's the 8th book of the Old Testament. So you go through Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy, then you go through Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And if you get to 1 Samuel, you've gone too far. If you're using your pew Bible, I think it's on page 220. But as you turn to Ruth this morning, let me talk to you a little bit about what Ruth is, or some things about Ruth that are pretty interesting. First of all, Ruth is one of only 2 books in the entire Bible that are named for a woman. So that in and of itself makes it pretty interesting and pretty important. But also, it's the only book in the Hebrew Bible, the only book of the Old Testament that's named for somebody who's not a Jew or not an Israelite, which is also pretty significant. Now, Ruth, the book of Ruth, it's a true story. That's another thing that makes it great, right? It's a true story. It's set in a real time and place with real people facing real-life situations, kind of what we face in our day, actually, things that we go through. And so in that way, it makes it more relatable for us, even though the book of Ruth takes place over 3,000 years ago. And that's because all the elements that make a great story, even today, if we read a great story or you go to a movie and it tells a great story, all of those elements that make a great story are found in Ruth as well. So Ruth is a great story. I mean, some of these elements like tragedy and challenge and friendship and loyalty and love we see in the book of Ruth, faithfulness, redemption, and even a happily ever after is in Ruth. And while Ruth deals with some pretty amazing people such as Ruth and a woman named Naomi that we'll meet, and a guy named Boaz, and even a little baby named Obed we'll find in the book of Ruth, none of these people are the stars of the story. Actually, the main character in Ruth is God himself. And as we look at this book of Ruth, we need to remember that God is behind and he's over all that's happening. And it's through his perfect plan and his love that we'll be drawn to him through this story and through these people we meet in this story and the situations that they face. And this is why we're calling our series here in Ruth, it's a little story about a big God. So as we look at Ruth, that's what we're going to be talking about. And today we begin this story, and we're kind of looking at an introduction to Ruth. Actually, the first few verses are kind of the introduction. But in this introduction, it is filled with twists and turns, ups and downs, leaving us nowhere to look but up. It really kind of comes in hard and gets there. It's only 2,500 words, the book of Ruth. 4 chapters long. It's not a long story, but yet it starts big and it continues big throughout the story. So I hope you're ready and buckle your seatbelts as we look into Ruth. So as we look at it, we have the first verse. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." So here we learn that this story or these events take place during what it says the time of the judges. And what's meant by the time of the judges, or when the judges ruled? Well, this is a time period in Israel's history between the just after the strong leadership they had from Moses coming out of Egypt, being led out of Egypt, and the leadership of Joshua, who then led them in to conquer the land and inherit the land, the promised land that God had for them. So it's after that time, but it's before the time when Israel has a king, before the time of King Saul. And this time period is about 300 years. So it's about a 300-year window where all of this happens. And it's this time of the judges. Well, what is the time of the judges? Well, let me set that stage for you. We have Joshua, right? And Joshua leads the people into the promised land, and they conquer, and he has them following God. In fact, right before his death, he challenges the people to be faithful to God. Remember, at the end of Joshua, he says, "Choose this day who you will serve. Will it be the gods of all these other nations, or will it be our God?" And everybody says, we choose God. We will serve the Lord. And then Joshua gave them a warning. He says, all right, if you serve the Lord, you'll be blessed in this land. But if you don't, if you're unfaithful to the Lord and following the Lord, he's going to send destruction. So just know these warnings. And after this, Joshua then dies. And the generation that came in with Joshua and made this oath before God, this covenant with God, they failed to teach that to their kids. So when the next generation rises up, they forget about this. And as a matter of fact, they look around them and they start to be unfaithful to God and worship all these other foreign gods around them. And they start to fall away from God. And so what happens when they're unfaithful to God is that God then sends them hardship. He sends them suffering. Sometimes in the form of an invading army, sometimes with just hardship in life and even the land fighting against them. And as a result of this hardship, the people would cry out to God, and they would say, "God, why have you forsaken us? God, help us." And God would send a rescuer, or what's called a judge. And these judges then would come in, and they would deliver the people and lead them back to freedom, or lead them back to God. And while this judge was alive, and while that generation was alive that came back to God, things would be great. But when after the judge died, the generation would die off, the next generation would rise up, and guess what? They would do the same thing. And this cycle is repeated over and over again in the book of Judges. And to the point where we see that it's a time where there's no spiritual leadership in the land, and the people kind of feel on their own. In fact, at the end of Judges, we see this phrase, and it's actually repeated throughout the book of Judges, but it kind of encapsulates this time and this time when Ruth is happening as this: everyone did what was right in his own eyes. God's people put their trust in themselves rather than in God. And this is kind of the climate or the setting of this book of Ruth. And during one of these judgments, God sent a famine to the land. That we learn here in Ruth chapter 1, there was a famine in the land, and this was a result of God's judgment. And this famine mentioned, there's actually a famine mentioned in the book of Judges that happens, it's a bad famine, and the whole land is affected by this famine, and it's actually in Judges chapter 6, right around the time that God raises a judge named Gideon, if you've ever heard of Gideon. So more than likely, the story of Ruth happens during this time, when there's this famine. Now, a famine is a God-controlled event. Remember, God controls nature. And famines, when they would come, would be a God-controlled event. And most of the time, famines were used by God as judgment or punishment against the people to lead them back to Him. But sometimes, a famine would also be used as a blessing and a means that God would use to move people to where He wanted them to be so that He could continue to work. In fact, we see a great example of this at the end of Genesis. Do you remember there was a famine then in the entire world? And Jacob and his family were driven out of the land that God had given them, and they went to Egypt because they had heard that there was food there. And here they're saved. They're rescued by who? One of their own, Joseph, who they had thought was long dead, but God had raised up and protected so that he could bring them salvation. So in that sense, a famine moved them so that they could be saved. But a famine is a bad deal. There's no food around. And it's a difficult time. And this famine even affected the city of Bethlehem, or the village of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem is a small, but it's a significant city down in the southern part of Israel, in the region of Judah. And it's mainly known for farming. It's got a lot of good barley and wheat and things like that. As a matter of fact, the name Bethlehem actually means house of bread. So this is how we know the famine's bad. It's even affecting the bread basket of Israel, where there always was food. So we have this Bethlehem, and it's ravaged even this place. And in this town is a man. And I think it's interesting that they don't even name him here, because what Ruth is saying, these are just ordinary people. This is not some ruler or anything like that. He's just a man. And he lived there. And to escape the famine, he takes his family to a neighboring country that he hears doesn't have a famine. So they go from God's promised land to go find their own rescue where there's no famine. And there's no mention here, notice, that they sought God on this. There's a famine in the land, there's this man, and he's got his family, and he says, hey, there's food over there, we're out of here. And he goes and tries to take care of himself and his family. So they escape to this neighboring country called Moab. And going to Moab was a big deal for the Israelites. Moab was right next to Israel. It was just to the east, over the Jordan River, right along the eastern coast of the Dead Sea, if we want to kind of get where Moab is. And Moab was a pretty evil nation. As a matter of fact, you want to know how Moab was kind of began. It began out of an incestuous relationship between Lot. Remember Lot? Abraham's nephew. After Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed, he went with his two daughters who survived, and he has an incestuous relationship with his daughters. And the son born to his oldest daughter was named Moab. So it's a whole nation conceived by just awful sin and trying to take matters into your own hands. And this is Moab. And not only that, but Moab was also a persistent nuisance to Israel. In fact, we see Moab always kind of picked at Israel when they were wandering in the wilderness, and then even when they got into the land. One of the third judge that comes along is a guy named Ehud, and he's raised up to kill or do away with the king of Moab, who had came in and was basically enslaving the people of Israel. And Ehud kills the king of Moab to free the people. So we have this nation of Moab. It's a very surprising place for an Israelite to go, and much less live. So this is kind of what we have just in verse 1. Now, in verse 2, this guy is finally named, right? The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his two sons are Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. So here we meet family members. We hear their names. But usually names mean something. Elimelech actually means God is our king, which is kind of ironic because Elimelech seems not to be following that, right? And then we also have Naomi. And Naomi is a very precious woman, and she's a very pleasant woman. In fact, Naomi means pleasant. And they have two sons. Mahlon is the oldest, and his name means sickly one. Isn't that a great name? And the other one, Chilion, his name means end is coming. Imagine having those names. You're sickly and your end is coming. Not exactly great things. And they actually, we'll find they live up to their names. real shortly here. But these are the two sons of Elimelech. And it says that they were from Bethlehem. Again, Bethlehem's mentioned a second time. You know, when any good story, if you hear something mentioned, especially early in the story, and you're like, that seems like an odd thing to mention here, and you hear it mentioned twice, maybe the author of the story is putting that in because it's pretty significant. And if we think, maybe there's somebody else who came from Bethlehem, right? Maybe that we may know about. We'll just leave it at that, right? Anyway, this family, it says they settled down in Bethlehem, right? Or they remained there. So they didn't just visit or go there temporarily. They went there and they lived. They put down roots. Okay, they made themselves at home, which isn't good, okay? It's going to be a recipe for trouble. But in their eyes, they're like, hey, we're out of danger. Everything's great. We're safe. Things are good. Well, things are about to go downhill. Look at verse 3. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her two sons. Now, we're not told how old her sons are here. They're probably teenagers, mid-teens or something like that. But Elimelech, the husband, the leader of the home, he dies. So imagine this. Okay, Naomi is now a widow, and she's far from her home, far from her family, far from all the security she had. And she's left basically as a widow to fend for yourself. In this world, if you were a widow, you were on your own. You better be taken care of by family. Well, since she's away from family, all she has is her two sons. So imagine her feeling lost and alone. So things aren't looking good, but maybe they are looking up because at least she has her two sons. And look what happens with her two sons. Verse 4, these sons took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. So these two sons, they want to get married. Why? So that they can continue their family line. So that they can make sure that there's a family there to help support Naomi and help live on and live their father's name on. And they're not in Israel anymore, so there's no Israelite women there, so they marry Moabite women. You might say, wait, they're not supposed to do that. Didn't God say they weren't allowed to marry that? No, he never expressly says don't marry Moabite women. What he does is he tells the children of Israel, don't marry any Canaanite women, which is in the promised land. He never expressly says don't marry a Moabite woman, but it's still not a good idea to do it because you're marrying outside of someone who worships God. Again, we always talk about that being unequally yoked, right? And they'll drift you away from God rather than bring you to God. And in fact, we see that happen with Solomon. One of his wives was a Moabite woman, and she actually led him into idol worship. So we see the danger there. But yet, what we get the sense of here, and what we'll get the sense of next week, is that Orpah and Ruth are actually good wives. They're good Moabite women, and they're good wives to these Israelites. In fact, there's the idea that they adopt or they conform to their new family, their new culture, and their new God in the God of their husbands and the God of Israel. So we kind of have that idea. But do you notice something here? It says at the end of the verse, they lived there 10 years. Do you notice something that's absent here in this story? What may be absent here? Kids. Back in that day, if you're 10 years and you're married and you don't have kids, something's the matter. Something's a little off, especially because that's one of the reasons why they're getting married, so they can continue their father's line and everything, and they don't have kids. And you may say, this is a tragedy. But wait, what we'll find out in the book of Ruth is that, again, it's a story about God, where he's the center, and it's about his plan. And he needs to keep Ruth for something special. So he makes sure they don't have kids at this point, because he has something bigger and better coming their way. But anyway, it's out of this sorrow that of losing her husband. Now Naomi is like, at least my sons have good wives, and we're a family again, and things are looking good again. Well, let's see if that continues. Verse 5. And now both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. So not only does her husband die and she's a widow, now her sons die. She has no link back to her past life. No link to her heritage. This is a tragedy that almost defies description. I mean, Naomi is in real trouble here. Not only has she left her home, her family, friends, and supports, but she's been widowed, which already puts her way behind and puts her survival in doubt. And now, though, she loses her sons too, the only ones that can take care of her and were supposed to take care of her. So she now has nothing and no one, and she is nowhere close to home. Woohoo! Ruth. Right? It's kind of like the beginning of the movie Up. You remember the movie Up? You know, when you watch that and they have this whole thing where they fall in love and you see all these pictures and you're like, oh, this is going to be a really nice movie. And then all of a sudden they go to an empty chair and you're like, what? It's the first 5 minutes. Well, this is the first 5 verses of Ruth, and look what's happened already. How did it even happen? There's just trial after trial, challenge after challenge, and misery seems to be compounding itself on them and on Naomi's life. Can you relate to how Naomi may be feeling right now? I mean, have you ever faced this kind of compounding misery in your own life where it just seems like where the hits or the challenges or the tragedies or trials, they just keep on coming. And you're just like, whew, all right, we've seen the worst of it. And then it gets worse. And then you're like, well, it can't get any worse from here. And somehow it does, right? And you just sit back and you're just like, what is going on here? And what happens at that? We start to get overwhelmed, don't we? It could be financial things that happen to us. It could be health things. It could be relationship things that just seem to keep happening. And we wonder what's going on. And we start to get overwhelmed and we start to lose hope. Like we just want to give up. We want to crawl in a hole and just give up. Well, it's through this passage we discover something very interesting and very important. And that's this. We see how quickly and easily misery can compound in life when we fail to walk with God. When we fail to walk with God through the challenges and through the trials we face, and instead we just try to face life doing what's right in our own eyes. Again, this time of the judges, right? And we try to do what's right in our own eyes, guess what happens? Misery will compound in our lives. And we see that through the story. In fact, we learned some very important lessons about how misery compounds in our life. For example, misery is compounded in our life, and we see it here in the story, when we fail to consult with God. Do you know that? When we fail to consult with God, misery compounds in our life. Look here in the story. When this family is faced with famine and lost, at no time do we see them seeking God, do we? No time does even Naomi said, we better return to our land and our God. Nowhere does she say, we need to trust God to provide for us. Nowhere do they seek God and His wisdom. There's no mention of praying. There's no taking time to listen to God, or even, at the least, seeking godly counsel for what they should do when faced with hardship in life. Instead, in the midst of this hardship, they see seemingly greener pasture somewhere else, and they just go. Have you ever done that? Have you ever had decisions and you just make the decisions without even consulting God, without even coming to God? You know, we ask for trouble in life when we do this. Because when we make decisions without seeking God, maybe it's changing our jobs. And we just say, I've had it with my job and I'm just going to find another job. But we're not seeking God on it. Or maybe it's a major purchase we need to make and we don't pray or we don't seek godly counsel. Or a new relationship. Or you know what? Even going to a different church. How many people that they're at a church and they just see something neat going on somewhere else, but instead of being led by God, they just say, oh, that looks good, let's try that. Bad things happen when we live life not led by God. And when we walk through situations we face in life and make decisions and we're not led by God. again, what happens when we don't consult God is we go into all these situations flying blind or going only by our limited wisdom and judgment. That, I don't know about you, but my limited judgment and wisdom isn't much. And when we fail to seek God's leading, and we can't make a decision in a godly way if we don't seek God. And you know, when I think of godly counsel, I think of one of my favorite people, Tom Horton. I miss him every day. But Tom's favorite verse that he would pound into us as students and even here at church, Proverbs 3, right? Where God says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him. Seek him. Consult with him. And he will make your path straight, or he will direct you. You see, that's how we avoid misery compounding or living our lives in misery and going from bad to bad to bad. And this leading that we seek in God, it's not the kind of leading, and maybe we say, well, yeah, if I seek God, so it's going to be like Monty Python where the big finger points out of the clouds telling us where to go, or like all the obstacles in our path just melt away and all of a sudden we're like, there it is, a bright light shining down on what we should do. It isn't always like that. When we're seeking God's leading. More often than not, we seek God and we seek his wisdom, is that we want to look at decisions we make through his priorities and say, am I being faithful to God with this? And we also trust the Holy Spirit in us to give us peace when we're making decisions, and so that he'll give us a peace in our spirit first. And there's great wisdom in looking to him first before we leap. You know, sometimes we go, just let me take a blind leap. No, that's how you get into misery. That's how you get into trouble. We should look before we leap, but not look at what we're leaping at. Instead, look to God and say, are you leading me here? And we also learn in our passage that misery is also compounded not only when we fail to consult God, but also when we step away from God. When we step away from what God has for us, and go seek something we think we should have, you know what happens? We find misery. We ask for trouble. Look what happens with this Elimelech's family here. After not seeking God, things get progressively worse when this family leaves the land that God had placed them in. Now, we may look at that and say, well, they just went over there. No. This was God's promised land that sustained the people, that led Abraham to leave his family and home to go into this land that God had prepared for him. And then when they were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, the people looked to this and said, but God has a land for us. God will make us a nation. And they leave Egypt and they wander in the wilderness and they're looking to this land that God has. And it was a land flowing with milk and honey, a land of fullness where God was going to bless them, and where God says, I have set this land up for you as a blessing to always provide for you, so that you will always be taken care of and always experience my blessing. Now, when we disobey God in that land, and when the Israelites would disobey God, God would discipline them. And even though Elimelech and his family here are facing God's discipline in this famine, instead, because they were unfaithful, because the people were unfaithful, instead of running to God for forgiveness and to seek him, instead, they sought somewhere else. Instead of running to God, they ran away. You want to know a way that we find trouble? You know what? Read the book of Jonah. We went through Jonah a few years ago. You want to know a life of misery? It's when God calls us to something, or God places us somewhere, and we run away from that. Instead of running to, we run away. And misery is compounded when we step away from God. And instead of in seeking to provide for themselves, they said, no, we need to be taken care of. We need to be full. We need to make sure that we're provided for. So Elimelech and his family, they go and they say, no, at least we're going to be full. You know, at the end of Ruth chapter 1, I want to take you to something Ruth says. Chapter 1, verse 21. Look to that. Here's what Ruth says at the end of this. After all this stuff happened, she goes, I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Do you get that? They said, we went away. God had everything we could ever need here, and this is his land for us, and it's his place that he has led us and given us, and we left it. And because we left it, everything we left it thinking we could get, we lost. And you know what? That's misery, isn't it? And that's what happens to us when we look to that and God places us somewhere. It could be in your job. It could be, with your family, in your neighborhood, your church, and in your Bible study. I mean, it could be all these places and you say, oh, this is great, but I think I want to go somewhere and I need to follow something that looks better. So when I look at this misery is compounded when we step away from God, it cuts me sometimes because I see myself in this. And I don't know if you see yourself in this, that sometimes we're like, man, yeah, I'm going to go and do it my own. Maybe we begin trusting God and we're doing okay, but then we give up on him way too soon when challenges and need arises. And we kind of abandon that. We can pray and we can trust God when things are going good, but when things aren't going good, we start to panic. We say, what do I need to do? And maybe we go it alone because we don't see God working fast enough, or maybe he's working maybe not in the way that we want it to go. Or maybe we leave his provision or what he has for us because we think we know better. And we think we know what we need better than he knows what we need. Well, know this. Nothing good can come when we leave what God has provided for us. Nothing good can come when we leave what God has provided for us, or we try to provide for ourselves. And we see this in Ruth, don't we? Misery is compounded and compounded. Now, in many cases, these failures and with not consulting with God and stepping away from him, they kind of help bring misery on ourselves, doesn't it? They kind of compound in the sense that they'll bring more tragedy by things that we failed to do or things that we're doing. But sometimes, trials in life come and challenges come and tragedies hit us through no fault of our own. Have you ever been there? You're doing everything right, and you're being faithful, and you're trusting God, but stuff just starts happening. And that can be the most frustrating thing that happens with us. And it can be discouraging because what's happening is not in our control. But do you know what? Misery in these situations is compounded when we don't trust God and don't trust that God is in control. You see, God never promises that we won't go through bad things, that we won't hit tragedies, that we won't have trials, that things will always go right with us. He never promises that. You know what he does promise? I'm bigger than anything you could possibly face. And even though as we look at the story of Ruth, we don't necessarily see it happening here, I've read to the end of it. Guess what? God is in control. God is with this. He is behind it. He is orchestrating all of this. He's got it. And so even when we can't see a reason for something happening or see a way through, we can still endure hardship, loss, trial, and pain with hope rather than misery. When we trust that in all things that God is in control. When we trust that God is in control, we trust that no matter what we're going through, God is bigger than it. So that if we're going through it, he's got something for us through it. And he's got us. He's not out to destroy us. But that he's still working even when we can't see him working. And even though we can't see the end, we can know that he's got it. And he has a plan. And it's always in place and it's always working. Just as it is here in this story of Ruth. God is going to accomplish his good through these people. And even though when we can't see the reason why we're facing trials, even when we can't see God working, we can still trust that he is and that he will give us what we need when we need it. What a hopeless place to be when we start to believe that our sin is too big that he can't forgive us, or that our failure that we may have is too great that he can't still work and he can't redeem, or that our challenges that we face are beyond his power What a hopeless place to be. You see, misery is compounded when we don't trust that God is in control. In fact, Paul said it like this in Philippians chapter 4. He says, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. You know another word for that? Full of hope. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger and abundance and need. And then a few verses later, here's how he brings this all together. And my God will supply every need of yours and need of mine according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. You see, Paul says, my hope isn't in my ability to overcome these challenges or even having a challenge-free life. I've seen it all, but I know I can get through it because I know that God is in control and he will provide. Drowning in our challenges and trials, it's not a pleasant place to be. As this story of Ruth opens, it's not a very pleasant story so far, is it? It's just kind of a scary story, but we're going to find that God is in control. And it can be downright miserable in our own lives when we're facing these trials. And our misery will continue to compound until we look towards home. Back to God, because he's in control and he's always working. And that's what we'll see through Ruth. Is they begin to, Naomi finally wakes up and she says, I need to look to home. See, we're never promised a trouble-free life, but our life still doesn't have to be miserable. God doesn't want us to go it alone. He doesn't want us to face trials in our life or make big decisions or to go through these challenges or tragedies that we face. He doesn't want us to go through it alone, doing what's right in our own eyes. Rather, he wants us to seek him, to stick close to him, and to trust him. You see, we find in this passage this. Even when things look their worst, God is still working. And that's our hope, even through this beginning of Ruth. And I hope you're kind of getting this in Ruth, that things look their worst, but don't worry. God is working, and there are great things in store. In fact, Ruth is probably the most renowned woman in the history of the world, probably the most important woman in the history of the world. And we're going to find out why through this story. But it's all through God and his plan that he is working, just as his plan works in and through us. Let's pray.